Hey guys, good to be here. Super cool talk. I hope I can really anchor sort of the end of my discussion against the opportunity at TDF and not even just TDF, but the broader OASA architecture, including some ideas for Africa, for Kenya. But yeah, I did want to start sort of with Silvi's mission, which is around obviously tree planting, but specifically helping meet the trillion tree goal that we've set up for ourselves. There's some debates and some controversy around this movement, but mostly because this movement has historically failed to address sort of the right tree for the right place. But for the most part, there is an opportunity to recover about a trillion trees globally. We had about 6 trillion trees just before the Industrial Revolution. We are now left with half of that at 3. And of course, we cannot recover all 3 lost because there's just a ton of agriculture land deployed towards food production. But there are some really cool studies coming out of the Crowther Lab and other forestry sort of academic institutions that have really sold the case for there being room for about 1 trillion trees, whether it's indigenous tree recovery or agriculture commodities like agroforestry. And this is the ugly trend that we're still in today around losing a ton of trees every year and not nearly making up for it with new trees. I do want to say that while Silvi is not involved in conservation, meaning protection of existing trees, I fully endorse that. I'm not saying that the solution is just tree planting. We also need to reduce tree loss. It's just that Silvi specifically is working towards solutions around new trees. Okay, so that being said, Silvi sort of has this like 3-tier vision in sort of in chronological time scale, what we hope to help uncover and unpack. In the short term, and I say short term, but this is still within the context of at least the next decade or two, is contributing towards carbon credits or carbon sequestration specifically. So the trillion trees, if successful, assuming we don't lose more, could sequester roughly 40% of the surplus CO2 in the atmosphere. And I say that this is not just CO2, those carbon sequestration units would come with a multitude of other benefits, of course, which brings us to our second point, which is really around ecosystem services recovered by that tree canopy. So things like biodiversity, things like all sorts of ecological benefits, water credits, air credits, endangered species intervention credits. There are a ton of solutions and innovations being architected today that might still see the light of day, but this is really sort of the longer term vision for Silvi. And then last but not least, just because we talk about crypto economics and sort of this idea of how do we peg financial industry to nature. This is sort of the ultimate goal for Silvi, is how can we build solutions and instruments and vehicles to help collateralize nature's value. I hope I don't sound like a capitalistic asshole, but ultimately I do think that this is what could actually protect nature, is if our financial systems are aligned to nature's values and not to profit-driven externality carrying value chains. So this is very shallow sort of slide. This is where we are today in terms of like carbon growth and ESG growth. Really, I think what we're striving to do is, again, focus less on carbon and focus more on biodiversity and broader eco credits. And the whole ESG bullshit also needs to change into more concrete solutions like the task force for nature-based financial disclosures, and of course the EBF frameworks that are now surfacing, and I think those are really the exciting things. In the US specifically, this is at the highest level of government, is a mission, and this is really about national what is it called, national security efforts, so the White House has the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and this has started a few administrations ago, all the way back to Obama, but is now sort of really materializing as an urgent matter to address, but potentially, and I say this because politics is also full of bullshit, but the US actually sees a roadmap to maintaining its financial supremacy in the world by innovating natural capital and leading that movement ahead of other superpowers like China. That being said, of course, that's not the reasons we want to develop natural capital, but this movement is happening. Natural capital data is making its way to balance sheets, whether it's at the national level, such as GDP alternatives, or in the private sector with things like carbon credits, which of course need to evolve into bigger and better things. But so what is Silvi doing? So Silvi is basically doing two main things. One is, how do we build instruments for tree funding to collateralize the net present value of trees themselves? Trees obviously take a while to grow, decades. They follow allometric models and different growth curves and impact curves, but ultimately we need to accelerate tree planting. And how can we fund that? And how can we build contracts that program that life cycle and also sort of assign stewardship benefits or ownership rights or whatever. And then the other thing is, of course, the tracking component, which is more, sort of part of the field of MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification, which we'll certainly cover a lot. This is an ever-changing slide, but this is roughly speaking sort of what the tree life cycle looks like. You need to start with planning and understanding what genetics and seeds you're putting on the ground, and then you need to ultimately produce inventory of those saplings. Sapling production, and specifically sapling cost, is one of the biggest barriers to reforestation globally, whether it's just the availability or the right availability. We have massive nurseries out there. Most of them focus on commodity wood products like timber, eucalyptus, pine. Unfortunately, very little is done towards the 70,000 native tree species around the world. So something like 95% of all saplings produced are within like a dozen or so different species types, which is very unfortunate. So we really need to build capacity towards indigenous native tree inventories. Of course, most of us think of tree planting as tree planting, putting trees on the ground, and that's another huge gap. Is there are so many logistics happening pre-planting and then ultimately post-planting, whether it's interventions and maintenance or continued measurement around that. So this is what the Tree Forward does. So this is the most recent thing we've done is this methodology configurator. There are 70,000 unique tree species out there, and there's an entire nuance of logistics. So some species need to be propagated through cold stratification, or they need to be scarred, or they need fire activation, or they need to be grafted. In agroforestry, this is a huge thing. You can't just reproduce avocados without grafting the Haas phenotype. And so this is sort of not known to most of us. And how do you ultimately scale this adoption and the stewardship? And so that's where the methodology configurator comes in. This allows you to define all types of event types or milestones, which the Tree Forward prescribes. So again, we've talked about sort of the life cycle of the tree, but how do you actually configure or program that specific recipe of sort of set of events that can A, guide stewards on the ground, but B, release payments in the form of tranches towards that stewardship happening. And then to back the methodology, there's sort of like an accounting system that we've done, and it's like a Web 2, Web 3 hybrid, but ultimately the payment of proof of maturity of a sapling, for instance, might be minuscule per sapling. But if you're producing a claim for 500 saplings or 2,000 saplings, all of a sudden that could amount to, let's say in Kenya, $20 for that event type alone, which is a great sort of injection of compensation to Kenya, and that's just with 2,000 saplings, which is really not a lot. Farmers can easily manage 20,000, 30,000 saplings at once. So I'll do some minor demos here, and then I'll kind of walk through what we can do in the field. Basically, on the left side, you have things like individual sapling or tree registration, which I'll do a demo. On the right side, you see an example of a more sort of propagation-specific event. We have the ability to register potted beds, seed beds, register mother trees, and then, of course, register planted sites. You also have an ability to log existing inventories of trees, whether it's to show the progress of a tree or to actually red flag a problem in the tree. Some other things we're building are more complex. So one of the things we're hoping to accomplish here at TDF is introduce higher resolution drone layer. And so here's an example of high resolution drone layer being rendered into a map via the tiles that captures a lot more resolution. So we'll be sort of accomplishing that hopefully in the next few weeks to be able to have both ground truth via human observation, but also via remote sensing, but not limited to like outdated low resolution satellite, which is a huge problem. So we were just in Sicily. Here's an example of how that can be a problem when your satellite data is very outdated. The direction of these trees actually is not following, I don't know if you can see over the screen, but it's actually sort of perpendicular to the old crop lines in that field. And so we've just captured some data, some drone data there, and then we'll overlay that orthomosaic into this. But and then the added benefit is there is a little bit of GPS error if you're not using a GPS antenna on the phone. And so once you have the high resolution drone data, the project owner can actually do a final calibration of the sapling sites. There are ways to automate this with some QR code flag, sort of kind of like flags. But these are examples of things we're experimenting with. So once your asset is registered, you have ultimately like an information card for each tree that shows sort of all the metadata, timestamps, stewardship, potentially ownership, and I don't say ownership in like a capitalistic extractive way. It's just what are the rights associated to that. And so some of the bigger conversations I think we should be having is how can we leverage Silvi to broker funding towards this natural capital inventory to, of course, compensate for stewardship, but potentially to leverage your vehicle as committed land with sort of long-term contract of sorts, right? So that's sort of the big vision here. Some of the project sites we've worked in the past have spanned Florida, Tennessee, and Africa. I won't talk about it too much today, just because I think the work happening at TDF maybe is a little bit more representative of rural, big volume restoration. But we basically have two theories of change, one being an urban and the other a rural. And I think for local nodes, the urban one makes a lot of sense. But ultimately, how can you scale urban stewardship? Because you certainly are not going to incentivize this through payments alone. In Kenya, if you're working with a big batch of saplings or planting hectares at a time, those payments, those micropayments scale to significant compensation. But in Miami or Lisbon, potentially, I think we really need to develop a lot more gamification. Nonetheless, we have sort of worked with very interesting models in Miami, for instance, where we have deployed small nursery sites across the city. We're working very closely with the Miami Environment Resource, with DERM, which is the Department of Environment and Resource Management, and I thought I had a spreadsheet here, but this is sort of what looks like a library of methodologies. Is you have your species list, and then you have sort of nuanced event types that can then be programmed through the configurator that I had just showed earlier, and then you can assign payment amounts. Actually, we use CUST, so we can basically configure those payments as well within the configurator and the percentage payouts per event. One quick thing I wanted to mention, actually I'll leave that for just in a second. I wanted to maybe cover Kenya just briefly, because I think that could be an interesting second place for OASA. But in Kenya, we're working in the Kakamega Forest, which is the remaining rainforest of East Africa. It was connected to the greater Congo rainforest, and now it's sort of like isolated pockets of sorry, my screen is not zooming for some reason. It's sort of like cut away. This is what happens when you zoom in. You basically see millions of smallholder farmers basically surrounding the forest. And I think this could be an interesting location for the OASA Eco Village concept, because there's actually an abandoned lodge there right at the intersection of the forest and the external community. Of course, our intentions there are to work with the local indigenous communities, develop methodologies for those species, and bring external capital. But we are working with sort of stakeholders in Kenya, such as the sort of Kenya Forest Services, the Kenya Wildlife, Rhino Arc, which is a conservation nonprofit there. Yeah, we're actually also sort of telling the story there by minting these limited collection T-shirts with a partner of ours called Blackbird Jeans, that sort of illustrates the fauna being protected, and for every tree sold, there's a tree that is actually being tracked. These are examples of the communities there in Kenya. This is actually a planting site. You can maybe see some saplings in the background. This is a relatively early stage MRV process, but the survivability rate was of 95%. And just for media, I guess, some examples of the community sort of capturing this. As mentioned, nurseries are a big example, and these were some sample registrations. But yeah, for the most part, in Kakamega, we've worked with 45 farmers and 140,000 trees, and we have maybe only planted about 5,000 trees, 5,500. The vast amount of the trees we are managing are still in sapling. So some are in late stage maturity, actually very near planting, and others are still getting started. It's a slow process, right? But with that said, maybe just to wrap up, if you guys are interested in this, we're writing a white paper, and all of this is sort of covered. It's a huge undertaking, but would love sort of public commentary and opinion here. Yeah. Of course, it covers some of the things that I discussed today, like tree forwards and the MRV process, but ultimately I think this white paper is looking to address the really ambitious existential approach to leveraging trees as a pillar for natural capital. And then to wrap up, I have two quick things. One is, and I'll use this as a primer to what we can discuss, which is SEV with Sunflower Ecotech is building an adaptive agroforestry methodology that actually scores biodiversity uplift and ecological sort of uplift via this index of point systems. The more important, I suppose, is the identification and inclusion of a preferred species list that could help accomplish things like a biodiversity corridor that supports local birds and butterflies and insects. A lot of the life around us depends on plants as hosts for reproduction or for to survive and to reproduce, etc. So we could maybe like unpack some of this just because it's quite developed and it's very promising. And we're actually doing this in Sicily, and I think maybe not for all the planting sites here, but for the agroforestry component, I think including the adaptive agroforestry process would be cool. But to wrap up the conversation here, sort of at a high level, I think what we're striving to do is really to be a data layer with some MRV solutions and some financial instrument solutions, but ultimately one that is interoperable and can allow for the composability of what we all are here to accomplish. We are collaborating with other entities like Sunflower, Ecotech itself, FarmOS. Our smart contracts are deployed on Celo. We leverage Celo's CUSD stablecoins, but we're open to other stablecoin payment systems. We're super interested in Regen Network's permissionless eco-credit registry approach. But sort of some of the conversations that are happening here are like, how do we integrate EBF, for example, as a unit of value or a measurement of uplift that we can, well, I don't want to say promise or guarantee because that enters into security law, and I know this is a big dilemma, but that we can nonetheless include in this commitment. Or things like OFP, and we're discussing with OFP, they're very interested in our work in Kenya, and we might actually help use the Silvi tree forwards as a project development unit of measurement and unit economics on the project, but then ultimately the on-chain carbon credits would be sort of a realizable value coming out of that. And then last but not least is like the tree forward right now is really meant to be a promissory instrument. As mentioned, we're still very early in this. We don't know exactly how biodiversity frameworks will evolve. All we know is they are under development. There's an appetite for that. That has to be the solution for habitat loss interventions, but a lot of it is still early. And so the tree forward is really a promissory instrument, and I think we want to maintain that language. But it would be good to include the intention and the commitment to capturing those values. And then this is like an old slide, but I brought it up just kind of illustrate some of this. There's the Silvi component, but there's so many other protocols happening. Gainforest, OFP, and others, and perhaps even the tree forward as a funding instrument could hold in escrow some of that budget towards other protocol services out there. And this is an example of some interoperability between Silvi and FarmOS. This was done through the Open Trees initiative, which is really attempting to create an open source structured tree data standard so that we can all speak the same language with regards to trees. But yeah, that's sort of Silvi. I would love at some point thanks guys. I think a huge focus, just so we're like productive as we close the week, is really to architect like a 3-5 year plan for the tree inventory, the land, and maybe get as close as possible to being able to broker this opportunity to outsiders. We would need to figure out, of course, this is now your turf, Sam, but I think there's like a balance to strike here. Does any of this MRV contribute to sweat, not sweat equity, what did you call? Sweat primitive was one of the, yeah. Can any of this like accomplish that? But also, how can tree forwards be funded to allow for immediate liquidity and budget, but maybe also accomplish hopefully some sort of ROI for that investment, and also contribute to like the accumulation of natural capital towards your treasury, which of course it would be up to the DAO and you to like decide how that is used. But ultimately, I think it's this story that needs to be communicated as like an experiment, And ultimately, through your leadership, Monty, and your insight on like EBF, how can we then take this to the next level to sort of replicate? So yeah, so excited for that, and I know TR is gonna explore it. Yeah.
I'm curious if, how much of your approach to the buyer side, like municipalities or governments or institutions or whatever, to kind of shows this, and have you had any conversations, like what are they looking for?
Yeah. We have some high-level conversations. In Miami, we're working with municipalities, mayor office, Office of Resilience, the heat office. We're triangulating a lot of stuff, but ultimately, like the heat office is addressing heat islands in the city of Miami, and part of their action plan is to incorporate more tree canopy, and that's outside the scope of like DERM, which is the Department of Environment and Resource Management. We initiated sort of a committee of experts to identify those species, and we're now working towards pilots where some private sector commitment and also government budgets will be piloting citizen-led forestry, and that's more on the urban side. On the rural side, I just visited Kenya. I had worked sort of predominantly like bottom-up with communities, not so much through the government, but having visited Kenya and with a lot of the progress there, we are entering into a bit of a collaboration with the Kenya Forest Services, so on two angles. One is to work directly on their gazetted lands, which is their official protected lands. And so we are adopting parts of those lands towards restoring it. And then the other is more of like an MOU on MRV strategic partnership. So it's like, how can we develop systems that can be adopted by that? I guess more importantly is we've partnered with one of the largest nonprofits in Kenya, which are recipients of external donor funding. Things like the Darwin Foundation, they work with the Nature Conservancy. And so I'm super excited about this partnership because they would use Silvi as a means to reporting on the impact toward, for the money they receive. But these are like small things, right? The goal here is ultimately to have a brokering system to really drive sort of retail and institutional investment towards new tree inventory, and then to capture that upside. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks, Brad.